In 1970, a man named Yoshinobu Nishizaki left his job as the owner of a Tokyo jazz club to enter the anime industry. He had been hired as a business manager at Mushi Productions, the studio created a decade earlier by the god of manga, Osamu Tezuka. In that role, Nishizaki produced two television adaptations of Tezuka's manga, Triton of the Sea, a fantasy adventure series notable for being the first show directed by future Gundam creator Yoshiyuki Tomino, and Wansakun, a comedy about his hawking dog. Nishizaki's tenure at Mushi ultimately proved to be short-lived. The studio had been plagued by financial difficulties since its incorporation, and was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1973. Undeterred, Nishizaki decided to stay in the anime industry. He established his own company, Office Academy, with the express goal of bringing to life an idea that had been circulating in his head since childhood, an image of an enormous battleship sailing through the sky. To bring this dream to life, Nishizaki assembled a team of 3 industry veterans from his Mushi Pro days. Keisuke Fujikawa, the chief scriptwriter on Wansakun, Aritsune Toyota, a scriptwriter on Astro Boy, and Eiichi Yamamoto, the director of Wansakun. Their initial proposal was called Asteroid Ship Icarus, but after consulting with Studio Nue member Kazutaka Miyatake, the asteroid ship was transformed into a retrofitted version of the legendary World War II battleship Yamato, and thus Asteroid Ship Icarus became Space Battleship Yamato. Legendary manga artist Leiji Matsumoto joined as art director the next year, and under his influence, the show began to take on its final form. The Yomiuri Network agreed to a 39-episode run, and it made its debut on Sunday, October 6, 1974. When the ratings came in, there was disappointment all around. The show received a paltry 6%. In hindsight, this was not surprising. The anime television landscape of the 1960s and early 70s was very different than it is today. With few exceptions, such as the first Lupin the Third TV series, most anime was produced for an audience of young children, and while there were some science fiction shows on the air, the vast majority followed the superhero formula, whether it be more conventional fare like Cyborg 009, or super robot series like Tetsujin 28 or Mazinger Z. A mature, serialized sci-fi narrative like Space Battleship Yamato was unheard of, and it's likely that audiences didn't know what to make of it. In response to this, Yomiuri cut the episode count from 39 to 26. Nishizaki, Matsumoto, and the rest of the crew refused to let this disappointment weigh them down. They proceeded as normal, and as the show continued, something unexpected began to happen. Though ratings never significantly improved from that initial 6%, Space Battleship Yamato began to find a dedicated following among audiences that were considered unconventional for anime of the day, including older kids, adults, and women. And when I say they were dedicated, I mean it. They cosplayed, they formed fan clubs, and they published fanzines. It's not an exaggeration to say that the response to Space Battleship Yamato basically created organized anime fandom in Japan. The show's staff were more than aware of this fan activity. Many of those fans had made a pilgrimage to the Office Academy headquarters to meet with them personally. This was certainly a shot in the arm for Nishizaki, who decided, when production on Space Battleship Yamato officially wrapped in March of 1975, that he wanted to turn the series into a movie. In need of funds to get the project off the ground, Nishizaki decided to sell the syndication rights for the show to any market who would take them. Sapporo was the first to rerun it in September of 1975, with additional markets following shortly afterwards. This second win was exactly what the show needed. When the movie finally premiered on August 6, 1977, Space Battleship Yamato had become a bona fide cultural phenomenon, eventually taking in over 2 billion yen at the box office. The impact that Space Battleship Yamato had on the anime industry cannot be overstated. It proved, beyond all doubt, that mature science fiction had a place in the industry, and demonstrated the uncompromising zeal of Japanese fandom. The future collision of these two nascent forces was all but an inevitability. In March of 1987, Gainax had just premiered their debut work, the sci-fi epic Royal Space Force: The Wings of Honneamise. After its release, there was a bit of uncertainty as to whether they should disband. After all, Gainax had formed for the specific purpose of creating Honneamise, and now the movie was finished. After some discussion, the studio heads, chief among them President Toshio Okada, decided that it would be a shame to call it quits after just one film, and thus Gainax decided to continue. They immediately set to work on their next project, a film called Route 20, Galactic Airport. Set to be co-directed by Yoshiyuki Sadamoto and Mahiro Maeda, the movie looked to be another ambitious sci-fi epic, taking place in a domed city that serves as mankind's last refuge from a world in shambles. In this depressing hellscape, a pair of biker punks must contend with the authorities, rival bike gangs, and the existential dread of trying to survive in a world that so obviously wants nothing to do with them. As was the case with the Wings of Honneamise, Gainax produced a pilot film for Route 20, a 3-minute montage set to the Doors' 1967 song The Crystal Ship. Though brief, the pilot more than demonstrates Gainax's brilliant animation and design talent, constructing a world that manages to feel both oppressive and aesthetically pleasing. Unfortunately, viewers would never get a chance to see the final products, as Route 20 was indefinitely postponed. The reasons for its cancellation have never been officially disclosed. Even Yasuhiro Takeda, Gainax co-founder and author of the studio's definitive historical account, the Nontenki Memoirs, merely stated that it was placed on indefinite hiatus without giving a reason why. Several theories abound that try to explain Route 20's fate. Many have speculated that it was canned because it was deemed too similar to Katsuhiro Otomo's manga series Akira, whose film adaptation was set to release the following year. The most common theory, however, places the blame on money, and this is the one I'm most inclined to believe. Recall, The Wings of Honneamise was a box office disappointment, not even making back half of its 800 million yen production budget. In light of that, Gainax probably didn't have the luxury to take any more serious risks for the foreseeable future. Their subsequent output seems to speak some truth to that. As for the next year, the studio entered a journeyman period, assisting with a number of works at the behest of others. In mid-1987, they were commissioned by the band Bowie to provide animation for the music video for their latest single, Marionette. Their animation shared much in common with the cancelled Route 20 film. Though it did not have a sci-fi setting, the two projects share a number of common features, namely a strikingly designed, ruined metropolis and a main character on the run from the authorities. Though it's unknown if the music video had anything to do with the song's performance, it is worth noting that both Marionette, as well as the album it appeared on, Psychopath, both reached number 1 on the Oricon charts. Gainax would produce an additional music video in 1988, this time working with the band Fence of Defense on their song Data No. 6. Directed by Hiroyuki Yamaga, Data No. 6 is very different, stylistically, than Marionette. Instead of trying to tell a story, the video mostly consists of abstract sci-fi imagery interspersed with rotoscoped footage of the band. Different as it may be, the video is nonetheless another visually striking example of Gainax's talents in action. They ended this brief stint as advertisers by working on a commercial for Victor's Hyper Robot Combo stereo system. The ad was another science fiction showcase, further establishing the association between Gainax and the sci-fi genre. Alongside these advertisements, the studio was also commissioned to assist on 2 OVA projects. One was called Mahjong Hishouden Naki no Ryuu. Produced by Magic Bus, this was a 3-episode adaptation of Junichi Nojo's Mahjong manga of the same name. Though Yamaga is credited as co-writer, the OVA should be considered more of a product of Magic Bus than Gainax. The lead creative figure on the project was Satoshi Tazaki, the head of Magic Bus and elder brother of the pioneering anime director Osamu Dezaki. Unfortunately, I can't say anything substantial about Mahjong Hishouden, as I don't speak Japanese and the OVA has to this day never been translated into English. The other OVA was by far the highest profile of all these journeyman projects. Bandai had tapped them to provide animation for Appleseed, an adaptation of the dystopian sci-fi manga by Masamune Shirow. On the surface, this would appear to be a match made in heaven, as Shirow, in his own way, shares Gainax's dedication to obscenely detailed science fiction world-building. Further, the irony should not be lost on anyone that a year after Gainax cancelled their own movie about a dystopian domed city, they were commissioned to assist on an OVA about a dystopian domed city. Unfortunately, the final product did not live up to this initial promise, as the Appleseed OVA is the dictionary definition of middling. The elaborate world, by far the most interesting aspect of Shirow's manga, was almost completely gutted, the end result being that the OVA felt like a standard terrorist thriller that just so happened to share the same characters as the manga. I'm not sure how much blame we should assign to Gainax for this, however. Like Mahjong Hishouden, this wasn't so much a Gainax anime as it was an anime Gainax happened to work on. Several other studios, AIC chief among them, came together to craft the final product. Additionally, none of the main Gainax staff were in any lead creative roles, with the scripting and direction mainly being handled by Kazuyoshi Katayama, a relative newcomer who would later make a name for himself directing the cult mecha series The Big O a decade afterwards. Though Appleseed may have fallen short of its potential, it's still an integral part of the Gainax story for several reasons. It gave the fledgling studio additional work to help keep its doors open, and most importantly, it showed that Bandai was willing to trust them with additional high-profile projects despite the box office disappointment of the Wings of Honneamise the year before. Remember, the movie didn't even make back half of its 800 million yen production budget, and as the main financial backer, Bandai must have taken a significant hit when it underperformed. They were under absolutely no obligation to continue supporting Gainax, and in fact it probably would have made more sense for them to end the relationships as soon as the box office receipts came in. Their decision to stick with Gainax demonstrates an unwavering faith in their potential as a studio, and what they chose to do next all but confirmed that faith. Bandai's producers approached Gainax with an offer. If they could propose an idea for an OVA that could sell at least 10,000 copies, they would fund it. Okada took this offer and ran with it, immediately crafting an outline for a new story before handing it over to Yamaga to write the screenplay. Yamaga warned Okada not to expect too much, that he was going to turn that outline into a stupid robot girl anime, but after receiving the final product, Okada praised it. With the screenplay in hand, the plan was to produce the project as 3 sets of 2 episodes, or 6 episodes in total. Shinji Higuchi was scheduled to direct. This would be his first time in charge of an anime production, having previously served as assistant director on the Wings of Honneamise. However, before the project could get off the ground, it was delayed. The reasons for the delay are not known. Takeda's account in the Nontenki memoirs is uncharacteristically vague. Despite this, he does mention something that may potentially shed some light on what was happening behind the scenes. According to Takeda, though they were committed to supporting Gainax's new project, Bandai's primary focus at that time was on another OVA series, Patlabor. Patlabor was the brainchild of Headgear, a team of artists consisting of Mamoru Oshii, the man who directed Urusei Yatsura and would later go on to direct the Ghost in the Shell films, Kazunori Ito, Oshii's screenwriting partner, Masami Yuki, the manga artist best known for Birdie the Mighty, Yutaka Izubuchi, a mech designer who would work on Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack the same year, and Akemi Takada, who was concurrently working as the character designer for the Kamaguri Orange Road TV series. Simply put, Headgear was the closest thing the anime industry's ever had to a supergroup, and from a business perspective, it's no surprise that Bandai would choose to prioritize their project above all else. This is pure speculation, but it's possible that the prioritization of Patlabor drained resources from their other projects, and Gainax suffered as a result. Whatever the case, the project was delayed, and as a side effect, Higuchi was forced to step down as director, as it was now in conflict with other projects he had already committed to. With nobody in the wings to replace him, Yamaga decided to reach out to an old friend, animation wunderkind Hideaki Anno. Anno had worked on the Wings of Honneamise the previous year, serving as one of the animation directors and being the animator responsible for the incredible rocket launch sequence at the film's climax. After production wrapped, he focused most of his energy on working with studio Graviton. Despite its name, Graviton was less of a conventional anime studio and more of a small collective of freelance animators. Anno had formed it in 1984 with his friend Shoichi Masuo, who he had met while animating the Macross movie Do You Remember Love? The lineup would be rounded out shortly thereafter with animators Koji Ito and Kazuhiko Nishijima. Though their output was relatively small, every anime Graviton was involved with were among the most impeccably animated works of the decade, including Megazone 2-3 Part 1, the 4th episode of Cream Lemon, better known as Pop Chaser, and Project Eiko, which Nishijima also directed. Anno's comfort zone had always been in animating high-concept action set pieces, and focusing on Graviton certainly afforded him more opportunities for this kind of work. All of that changed, however, when Yamaga reached out to him. He sent Anno his script, and by his own admission, Anno was moved to tears as he read it, and he agreed to join the project as the replacement director. With Anno at the helm, the project officially entered production, and on October 7th, 1988, Japanese fans were greeted with the first 2 episodes of Gainax's new effort, Gunbuster. Anyone who bought the first 2 episodes of Gunbuster after having seen the Wings of Honneamise must have experienced whiplash. Instead of another understated, contemplative character study, Gunbuster seemed to more than live up to Yamaga's warning of being a stupid robot girl anime. Though, to be fair, just looking at the title would have probably given fans enough of a hint to know what they were in for. Gunbuster's full title, Aim for the Top Gunbuster, gives away two of its biggest influences, Top Gun, the 1986 Tom Cruise movie, and Aim for the Ace, the classic shoujo tennis series, and it's here that I want to focus most of my attention. For those who haven't seen it, Aim for the Ace is the story of Hiromi Oka, a high school girl who joins her school's tennis team. She idolizes Reika Ryusuke, the team's star player whose grace and skill has earned her the nickname Ochofujin, or Madam Butterfly. Despite wanting to succeed, Hiromi is plagued with anxiety and self-doubt, but thanks to the effort of the team's new coach, who sees in Hiromi a potential that even she herself does not recognize, she begins to grow. With that in mind, here's the plot of Gunbuster. It's the story of Noriko Takaya, a student of Okinawa Girls Space Pilot High School. She looks up to Kazumi Yamato, her class's ace whose beauty and elegance have earned her the nickname the Rose Queen. Despite wanting to succeed, Noriko is plagued with anxiety and self-doubt, but thanks to the effort of her school's new coach, who sees in Noriko a potential that even she herself does not recognize, she begins to grow, and alright, I think you see where I'm going with this. The setup to Gunbuster is almost identical to that of Aim for the Ace, with a number of scenes in the first episode mirroring those in the classic shoujo series. On the surface, this notion of a show that echoes a timeless shoujo story, only with giant robots, is patently ridiculous, and more than earns Yamaga's stupid robot girl anime description. Dismissing the show this quickly, however, is not fair at all. For starters, though the core concept may seem ridiculous, Gunbuster plays it completely straight. At no point does the show prime us either to laugh at its premise or mock its characters. It wants us to invest in Noriko's struggle, as any other shoujo sports series of its time would. And about Noriko. Though modeled after Hiromi from Aim for the Ace, she's far from a carbon copy. Hiromi's initial reason for joining the tennis team is to get close to Ochofujin. She doesn't really take the sport itself entirely seriously at first, with her and best friend Maki Hikawa openly admitting they don't plan on turning pro. By contrast, while Noriko admires Kazumi deeply, she was not the reason for her decision to enroll in pilot school. Her decision was a very personal one, and that decision sheds light on the depth lying beneath the surface. The world of Gunbuster is one where mankind faces extinction in a war against an enemy of insectoid aliens known only as the Space Monsters. 8 years prior, Noriko's father, Admiral Juzo Takaya, was commissioned aboard the Earth's first faster-than-light ship, the Luxion, and sent on an exploratory mission to the Perseus arm of the Milky Way galaxy. The Luxion was ambushed by the Space Monsters, with Admiral Takaya presumed dead. Admiral Takaya's absence, both before and after his death, must have had a profound impact on Noriko. It's telling that throughout Gunbuster's 6 episodes, her mother, and indeed any other family aside from her father, isn't so much as hinted at. Without her father, Noriko was basically completely alone. Her dream of pursuing a military career is a confluence of a number of factors: a way to get closer to the father whom she never really got a chance to know, a means of getting revenge on the space monsters for his death, and perhaps most distantly, an opportunity to search for him on the off chance he's still alive. This is a fantastic foundation for Noriko's character. That being said, I understand if fans didn't quite pick up on it right away, as aside from the parody elements, the show's focus in that first episode is, shall we say, on other things. Yes, Gunbuster is actually a landmark series in the history of animation, as it's the first show in which significant attention was paid to animating the female character's breasts bouncing. The debate rages on if this is an animation milestone, or if it's the equivalent of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but that's for another video entirely. Thankfully, unlike many other shows of its ilk, Gunbuster's story is strong enough such that it doesn't feel cheapened or degraded by its fan service. And let me just add one more thing. The character designs are courtesy of Macross alum Haruhiko Mikimoto, who I'm convinced is incapable of drawing any female who's even slightly less than gorgeous. Anyway, getting back on track. The first episode, as expected, hits all the major plot beats as would be expected from Aim for the Ace. Noriko is chosen to join the elite top squadron with Kazumi despite her lack of skill, leading to accusations of nepotism given her father's position as admiral. The new coach, Koichiro Ota, refuses to change his mind, and after instilling in her the idea that hard work and guts is the key to achieving her dream, Noriko finds the strength inside of her, such that when the school bully, Kashihara, challenges her to a duel, she's able to beat her with a lightning kick, an advanced move that even the best in her class find difficult to master. With the duel over and Kashihara put in her place, Noriko and Kazumi leave Earth for the spaceship Excellion as newly commissioned members of the Top Squadron and the first line of offense in the war against the space monsters. And honestly, as an ending, it's not a bad one. Noriko overcoming her insecurities and getting the once-over on those who didn't believe in her is greatly satisfying. But if that's where Gunbuster would have ended, it would have gone down as an entertaining Aim for the Ace homage and not much else. But Gunbuster is so much more than that, and it's in episode 2 where we get a better idea as to why. Much like episode 1, episode 2 hits the audience with whiplash, albeit for very different reasons. The opening scene is a flashback, showing the final tragic moments of the Luxion's demise, and Admiral Takaya's decision to let Coach Ota escape in his place. The levity of the Aim for the Ace parody is completely gone, with the episode feeling much closer to the opening of Space Battleship Yamato than anything else. The comparisons to Yamato aren't empty ones. The Gainax crew are, of course, outspoken fans of the series, and Kazutaka Miyatake, who worked on Yamato as a member of Studio Nue, provides mechanical designs, and his sensibilities are obvious to anyone who's seen both shows. Colossal spaceships, profoundly detailed instrument panels, and control rooms that seem to dwarf the human beings inside of it. The music also invokes memories of Yamato. Aside from the unabashedly poppy opening and ending themes, Kohei Tanaka's orchestral score provides the show with a pervasive atmosphere of grandiosity, much as Hiroshi Miyagawa did for Yamato a decade prior. All these Yamato echoes don't mean the Aim for the Ace influence is completely gone. It's diminished, to be sure, but you can still feel it. Take, for instance, when Noriko and Kazumi arrive in space. Among the new recruits to the Top Squadron is Jung Freud, another ace pilot flying for the Soviets.
The Russians? Exactly. The Soviets.
Jung is perhaps the only other pilot to equal Kazumi in skill, and Kazumi is not oblivious to this potential rival. This is actually really interesting from a psychological perspective. In episode 1, Kazumi, for the most part, seems as level-headed as someone nicknamed the Rose Queen would suggest. She encourages Noriko when she's discouraged and calls out Kashihara for her bad behavior. The one time she seems to act out is when she confronts Coach Ota about Noriko's appointment to the Top Squadron, but this is only due to her concern for the health of the squadron itself. Her reaction to Jung is the first time we see some cracks in the facade. For all her elegance, Kazumi is still as prone to the same flashes of unreason as all others her age are. Jung and Kazumi sneak off into their mechs for an impromptu duel, with Noriko following as an observer. Their duel eventually leads them to a sealed-off area of the space station, where, to their horror, they discover one of the space monsters in captivity, and this causes Noriko to completely break down. To be fair, the space monster is terrifying, an unsettling combination of beauty and eldritch horror that would leave any pilot breathless. But what interests me is Noriko's reaction as compared with Kazumi and Jung's. Most would be content to explain it away just as a manifestation of her naivete, but there seems to be more going on than just that. The first episode demonstrated that there's a bizarre incongruence in Noriko's skill level. Outside of her robot, she's basically perfect. She can complete her jump rope training, for instance, without so much as a second thought. But once she's in the cockpit, she can't perform even the most menial of tasks without making a fool of herself. Again, I don't think this can be explained away by her lack of experience. Consider, though it's her dream to become a pilot, accomplishing that dream means having to confront some very uncomfortable realities. She's going to have to do battle with the very forces that destroyed her father's ship, and perhaps discover firsthand that her father is dead. More than just lack of experience, Noriko's difficulties in the pilot's seat seems a psychological block set up to prevent her from confronting those unpleasantries, and her encounter with the captive space monster is the first instance of what happens when those unpleasantries hit home. Eventually, the girls are caught. Though they should be punished, the human race simply doesn't have the luxury of weakening the Top Squadron, so they're merely placed on probation. Ironically, this was probably the best thing that could have happened, as it forces the three girls to grow closer, to get acquainted not just as fellow pilots, but as human beings and friends. Jung even realizes she and Noriko share a birthday, and makes a point to plan to have a dual celebration once it rolls around. Unfortunately, their time together ends as quickly as it began, as the reality of their mission begins to rear its head. News reaches the Excellion that a massive object of unknown origin is rocketing towards Earth at sublight speed. For the safety of the human race, a reconnaissance team must immediately be sent to scout, and Coach Ota recommends Noriko and Kazumi. It's here that the true horror of their mission finally reveals itself. Coach tells the girls that because they're going to approach the object from as close to light speed as they can, time will pass more slowly for them than for everyone else in the universe. Every minute for them equals 3 months for everyone else. This concept, referred to as time dilation or the Rip Van Winkle effect, is the linchpin of Gunbuster's drama, and even today, over 3 decades later, it remains a relatively unexplored trope in science fiction storytelling. Certainly in 1988, no other anime series had used it to dramatic effect, not in mecha shows, and not in conventional sci-fi shows, but it had a somewhat more active life in literature, and this is where Gainax took it from, specifically from Joe Haldeman's classic 1974 novel, The Forever War. Next to Aim for the Ace, The Forever War is by far Gunbuster's most significant influence from a storytelling perspective. The novel's setup should immediately sound familiar. In the future, a mysterious race of alien beings called the Taurians began attacking human ships. In response, the United Nations Exploratory Force assembles a task force of elite soldiers, puts them through grueling training regimens, and sends them out across the universe to defeat the Taurians. As you can see, it's almost identical. And that brings up an interesting point. Obviously, Gunbuster is a giant robot show, but with its biggest influences including a shoujo sports series and 2 classic space operas, just what is Gunbuster's place in the mech anime tradition? Up to that point, giant robot shows usually fell into one of 2 categories. There's the super robots, shows like Mazinger Z and Getter-Robo, where the titular robots are basically superheroes, fighting larger-than-life villains with machines that have powers that are almost indistinguishable from magic. Then there's the real robots, shows like Gundam or Votoms, where the realism is given a much greater place of prominence. The machines in these shows are far from superpowered miracles. They're tools of warfare, common as grains of sand, easily replaceable and destroyed. Gunbuster doesn't fall neatly into either of these categories. Sure, it has the militaristic atmosphere and character depth common in real robot shows, and the otherworldly antagonists and larger-than-life titular robot indicative of super robot shows, but it would be a mistake to pigeonhole it as either one. Really, Gunbuster was something completely new, and this can most easily be seen in what the show chose to focus on. Whether super or real, robot shows before Gunbuster tended to be structured in a similar way, and that each episode was framed around a battle scene near the end. Super robot shows are literally referred to as Monster of the Week shows because each episode revolved around a new enemy for the robot to destroy. Real robot shows, as a rule, were more serialized in their narratives, but still tended to build towards a climactic battle. The early Gundam shows are probably the best example of this, perhaps because Yoshiyuki Tomino cut his teeth in the 70s as a director on super robot shows like Brave Raideen and Zambot 3. Gunbuster is not like this. Gunbuster is, first and foremost, an exploration into the psyche of Noriko Takaya. Everything else, the action, the world building, what have you, is in service to that end. If an episode doesn't require a high-concept action set piece to make its point, it won't use one, and the end of episode 2 is an excellent example of this. Noriko and Kazumi approach the unknown object, discovering that it's a derelict ship. Approaching it from the side, Kazumi makes a startling revelation. It's the Luxion. Horrified, Coach Ota screams for Noriko to stay away from the ship, but his pleas are in vain. As if overtaken by sheer animal instinct, Noriko bursts through the hull of the ship in a desperate attempt to look for her father. Because of time dilation, though 7 years have passed for her, only 2 days have passed on board the ship, meaning there's a real possibility that Admiral Takaya could still be alive. Every one of Noriko's worries and anxieties have led to this moment. Far from a gigantic space battle, this is where everything in Gunbuster had been heading up to this point. Unfortunately, the news is not good. The ship's bridge is destroyed, leaving no doubt concerning Admiral Takaya's fate. Noriko is completely unable to function, forcing Coach to drag her from the ship and out of sublight. He succeeds, but due to this unforeseen delay, their mission went 12 seconds over the limit, meaning their return to the Excellion was months later than anticipated. Noriko and Jung's dual birthday celebration had come and gone, without one of the guests of honor in attendance. For her part, Jung tries her best to acclimate the returning crew, wishing them a welcome back and trying to wish Noriko well, but it's for naught. Noriko is far too damaged for her goodwill gesture to have any effect. This entire sequence is profoundly emotional, and demonstrates so well Gainax's attitudes towards their influences. As we've already seen with Aim for the Ace, though they may wear those influences on their sleeve, they're far from content to just plunder them without transforming. Let's look at the Forever War this time. Haldeman was a Vietnam veteran and used time dilation as a way to parallel his experience returning to the US at the end of the war, finding the country almost unrecognizable to when he left. In Gunbuster, what matters is less about how the outside world changes, but how those closest to the main characters change. We see a small example at the end of episode 2. Jung is able to celebrate her birthday as planned, while Noriko not only misses the party, but in some ways misses her birthday entirely. After all, she was only in sublight for a matter of minutes. She may as well be the same age. But more than that, time dilation makes it all but impossible for the characters to work through their traumas in a natural way, because really, only 2 days have passed since the Luxion disaster, the wound remains as fresh as the hole torn into the ship's bridge. The idea of Noriko being able to naturally progress through the 5 stages of grief is beyond unrealistic. Things seem to start off well enough, though, with Noriko and her cohorts staying up late telling scary stories and playing games of dare. Noriko herself draws the short straw and is dared to tie a bandana in one of the ship's hangars. Walking around the abandoned hallways, Noriko must have felt that she had been transported into one of those scary stories, with its gloomy corridors and mysterious noises. This gets amped up to 11 when she realizes that she's being followed. Is it a ghost? A monster? No, it's one of the male pilots named Smith Torin. He's a goof, and Noriko finds him a bit patronizing, but there's something about him she can't explain that draws her closer to him. Turns out, the boys have the exact same goofy dare games as the girls, and Smith is out trying to do exactly the same thing as Noriko. Unfortunately, the two are caught by Coach, and as punishment, are sentenced to clean the lenses on the Excellion's laser cannons. Just as Noriko was able to grow closer to Jung after being punished in episode 2, the same thing happens with Smith, despite his obnoxious personality. In short order, Noriko realizes she's in love with him. Now, I've heard fans criticize Noriko and Smith's relationship, arguing that it develops unrealistically quickly. Perhaps there's some truth to this. Part of it has to be chalked up to the short OVA format, which necessitates the story as a whole being condensed. But despite this, I feel that while their relationship does progress faster than we may be used to, it makes sense, especially where Noriko is at emotionally. To put it bluntly, Noriko is not in a good place. She may have earned some goodwill after her victory against Kashihara in episode 1, but at this point, that's been all but squandered. The potential that victory demonstrated hasn't translated into actual space combat. And to be clear, Noriko is well aware of where she stands in the eyes of her cohort. Her decision to participate in the dare was mostly one made out of peer pressure, an attempt to be a team player when most of the others aren't holding her in high esteem. But as she learns shortly afterwards, this doesn't lead to any positive change, as, while inside her machine weapon, she overhears a conversation between Kazumi and Coach, where the Rose Queen requests a transfer, saying that Noriko is too inexperienced to be her partner. And remember, this is Kazumi, the one who's probably been the most sympathetic to Noriko since the beginning. If she's at her breaking point, one can only imagine where the rest of the top squadron is. That all in mind, Noriko's attachment to Smith starts to make a lot more sense. Sure, he may enjoy getting under her skin a bit too much, but at this point, he's the only one who's treating her with any kind of dignity, and because she now has conclusive proof that her father's gone for good, Noriko's going to cling to him as hard as she can. Lucky for her, Smith volunteers to be her partner, and soon the two sortie for their first battle as a team. Again, if this were any other giant robot show, we would expect some impeccably animated action scene here, but that's not what we get. Instead, we find a conscious mirroring of the episode's opening, only instead of an empty corridor, Noriko is in the vastness of space. Smith is there as well, technically, but he's out of her sight on the offensive. The enemy's out of her sight too, moving so fast she can hardly see them. Completely isolated, facing an enemy who totally outclasses her, she's unable to even move. Perhaps if Smith were closer, she could break out of her stasis, but her calls go unheeded. It's only when she returns to the Excellion after the battle when the truth hits her. Smith is dead, one more in the growing procession of those who have died and left her behind. His death seems to be the final shot in the arm Noriko needs to become a fully fledged member of the top squadron, and begins training harder than ever before. But if you think this newfound determination will break her out of her stasis, think again, as the road to recovery from any sort of trauma is far, far from straightforward. Jung watches Noriko train from a distance. For the first time in ages, Noriko's latent abilities seem to go noticed, but instead of being happy or supportive, Jung is both paranoid and insecure. All she can see is another potential rival capable of dethroning her from her position in the top squadron's hierarchy, so just like she did with Kazumi in episode 2, Jung challenges Noriko to a duel. Unlike the skirmish with Kazumi 2 episodes ago, however, this duel ends before it begins, as Noriko, once she's in space, is paralyzed by fear. Once again, her training seems to mean nothing, as her traumas and anxieties block her from doing anything. Afterwards, Jung and Kazumi have an argument about what transpired, with Jung straight up admitting Noriko will die if she goes into space again. Coach seems to agree with Jung's assessment, as in response to Jung's partner Linda's machine weapon being out of commission due to technical issues, Linda gets placed in Noriko's machine weapon instead, leaving Noriko officially sidelined. Her training seems to have meant nothing, as Noriko finds herself at arguably her lowest point since the series began. As if that weren't bad enough, the rest of the Excellion find themselves in even worse straits. The space monsters are somehow able to attack the ship in the midst of sublight speed, causing it to return to normal space. As a result, mankind's worst nightmares are realized. The space monsters now know the coordinates of planet Earth. The top squadron mounts an emergency defensive maneuver, but it has virtually no effect, with the squad suffering massive casualties. While all this is going on, Noriko is holed up in the Excellion, still an emotional wreck. And it is here, at both her and mankind's lowest point thus far, that she manages to find the strength to carry on for good. Time is a luxury that neither she nor the rest of the human race has anymore. As terrifying as the prospect of interstellar war is, confronting it is her only choice. Doing nothing is cowardice, and she's going to have to do it alone. Her father and Smith are no longer alive to protect her, but she realizes now that just because people are dead doesn't mean they can't protect you. Their memories will always be with her, and those memories, in some ways, keeps them alive. With that breakthrough, Noriko leaves to join the fight, but with Linda having taken her machine weapon, she's going to need a bigger mech. As the rest of the Excellion laments their fate, a lone hangar opens, and an enormous black mech inches its way onto the battlefield, its arms folded as if the threat before it is non-existent. This, after almost 4 episodes, is the debut of the Gunbuster, mankind's secret weapon in their war against the space monsters. The Gunbuster had been hinted at throughout the series, mostly in hushed tones, what the most the audience could decipher was that it was some kind of weapon that Noriko was a candidate to use, but none of those hints could have prepared anyone for its debut. At 240 meters in height, the Gunbuster was, for almost 2 decades, the largest giant robot in the history of the genre. With such a larger-than-life machine, it's no surprise that any moment when the Gunbuster is on screen is when the show draws the most from the super robot well. Attacks are executed by screaming, its power seems all but limitless, and even its signature arms folded pose, which has subsequently been christened the Gainax pose, is an homage to a panel in Ken Ishikawa's Getter Robo manga. Despite these illusions, once again, Gainax is not content to use them as empty references. The mere fact that it took 2/3 of the series for the titular robot to make its debut appearance is enough to show that the studio is doing something much different than your typical super robot spectacle. In truth, the Gunbuster could not have debuted any sooner than it did, because its appearance is meant to punctuate Noriko's complete transformation from the damaged novice pilot to the savior of the human race. With the memory of those she loves carrying her forward, Noriko, and the Gunbuster by extension, can destroy any obstacle in her way, regardless of how insurmountable they may seem. By the time Noriko and Kazumi return to Okinawa, it's 2032, 10 years after they had left for the Excellion. The effects of time dilation are powerfully portrayed in 2 different scenes. In the first, the 2 girls are finally given their diplomas, a full decade after all their classmates. The shot of the auditorium, empty save for the 2 girls, hammers home the notion that every one of their classmates have moved on with their lives, while they remain frozen in time. This is further explored when, as Noriko is enjoying some much-needed leave from her military duties, she runs into a woman she quickly realizes is her best friend, Kimiko Higuchi. Kimiko is someone we as an audience haven't really seen since episode 1. There, she spent most of her time telling Noriko's fortune rather than focusing on her piloting skills. The character we see in episode 5 is in many ways an entirely different person. She's mellowed out, married, had a daughter named Takami, and doesn't bring up fortune-telling even once, instead remaining fixated on trying to secure Takami a spot on the state-of-the-art evacuation ship the Eltrium. Despite feeling like no time at all has passed, Noriko has never felt so far away from the friend she cares about so much. The distance is all the more emphasized in the following scene, where we see, amazingly, that Noriko is a hardcore anime fan. Yes, Noriko's room is filled with posters upon posters of famous anime series and movies. The idea that Noriko is an anime fan is one that has been brought up in the past. In one of the science lessons, the SD shorts that punctuate each episode with humorous explanations of both the real and fictional science explored in the show, she straight up admits it. But the science lessons are humorous omake. The audience didn't have to take that admission seriously, but seeing her room in episode 5 makes her fandom an explicit part of the show's text. Some of you may be wondering why I'm spending so much time on this point. After all, Gainax is a studio comprised of hardcore anime fans. It would be easy enough to dismiss it as some goofy fan service and leave it at that. But many critics have taken this notion of Noriko the anime fan as thematically relevant to the show itself, and actually, I'm inclined to believe them. What characterizes fans? Not just of anime, but any sort of hobby. Where most people are inclined to quote-unquote grow up and put away childish things, fans don't do that. They hold on to their interests, many of which they acquired in childhood, well into their adult years. Much like Noriko, it's as if fans remain children while the rest of the world passes them by, but Gainax clearly does not consider this a bad thing. Noriko, precisely because of her unique situation, is able to pilot the Gunbuster and save the world from the space monsters. What's the fan parallel? In my eyes, because fans abandon any semblance of a normal life, they are able to, potentially, harness their passions to create something beautiful. It's a refreshingly positive view of fandom that Gainax could back up with personal experience. After all, they were living proof of its veracity. Anyway, Noriko is barely given time to get used to this new reality of her friends becoming mothers when news breaks that a space monster invasion force is headed towards Earth. Defense Command is unable to agree on a strategy to defeat them, when Coach Ota storms in and recommends detonating the Excellion in the center of the fleet, creating a miniature black hole. The strategy is not popular with Defense Command, but they give it the order to proceed. Mankind has no time left. As part of the mission, Noriko and Kazumi will escort the Excellion in their buster machines, the two components that combine to make the Gunbuster. Entering Coach's office, Noriko is surprised to see Kazumi running out crying. Confused, Noriko proceeds inside, where she finds Coach Ota throwing up blood. As she attempts to call for help, Coach cuts her off, threatening her with death if she reveals the extent of his condition. It's here that Noriko understands what's going on. Kazumi is in love with Coach, and she's worried about leaving him in this condition. Noriko attempts to comfort her by suggesting that the two get married once the mission is over, but Kazumi knows that that's an impossibility. Coach has cancer, and because their mission is scheduled to run 6 months Earth time, he's probably not going to be around when they return to Earth. The 6 months pass by in a matter of seconds, and on the dot, Kazumi freezes, unable to cope with the thought of Coach's death. The status quo that has prevailed throughout the entirety of the series thus far now finds itself completely reversed, with Kazumi echoing Noriko's earlier frailty. It's at this moment where we see just how far Noriko has come. Drawing from her experience of losing her father and Smith, she begs Kazumi not to give up. Coach, Jung, Kimiko, every single human being is counting on them, and if she gives up the fight, their inevitable deaths will be for nothing. In what is perhaps the most emotional moment of the series up to that point, for the first time in 5 episodes, Noriko punctuates her begging by calling her friend by her first name. This is the moment that snaps Kazumi back to reality, and the two girls combine to once again form the Gunbuster. This is, by far, the most balls-to-the-wall action scene in the entire series. Even the music, an upbeat pop number sung by Noriko Hidaka and Rei Sakuma, sounds like it could be the opening to some insane OVA adaptation of a Go Nagai robot show. But again, if the scene is examined thematically as we've been doing, it makes perfect sense why it should be this way. The combined passions of Noriko and Kazumi, with the might of the Gunbuster on their side, can do anything. As the girls themselves say, the Gunbuster is not some ordinary machine. It has Coach's beating heart within it, a wonderful application of the lessons Noriko learned from the deaths of Smith and her father. And it's that connection, with their loved ones, with their histories, with everything they've experienced thus far, that's able to carry them through the battle. It's not for nothing that the girls use the lightning kick, for the first time since the end of episode 1, to put the space monsters in their place. The mission, in spite of all odds, is a success, and what's more, Noriko and Kazumi return to find Coach still clinging on to life. Kazumi, completely overtaken with emotion, confesses her love, and Coach reciprocates. The episode ends on this utterly triumphant note, but you would be mistaken if you thought that this was the end of the story, for although mankind may have won the battle, the war is far from over. 15 years have passed since the end of Episode 5. The detonation of the Excellion destroyed 3 of the solar system's planets and permanently shifted the Earth several degrees on its axis. Kazumi has become a coach at Okinawa Girls Space Pilot High School and married Coach Ota, who has sadly succumbed to his illness. As much as she appreciates her new life in Okinawa, she realizes that right now, she's needed back in space. In a final, last-ditch effort to destroy the space monsters once and for all, mankind decides to go on the offensive, launching a 1,000-fold greater version of the Battle of the Absolute Defense Line from the previous episode. Instead of destroying a ship, the planet Jupiter itself has been converted to a massive black hole bomb, which, when detonated in the center of the Milky Way, will destroy the space monsters at the source. As should be painfully obvious, Episode 6 of Gunbuster is orders of magnitude more somber than anything that had come before. This sudden headfirst dive into this pervasive solemnity has led to Gunbuster being labeled as an early example of what would come to be known as a Gainax ending, a storytelling trope characterized by a sudden, 180-degree shift in tone, genre, or just plain sensicality. In a way, I can see the logic of that judgment. What started as an aim for the ace parody with giant robots has ended with humanity racing to detonate the planet Jupiter in the center of the Milky Way galaxy to stave off a potential mass extinction event. How the hell could we have gotten from point A to point B? Well, there's actually more of an internal logic than the show is given credit. From Episode 1's opening narration, when Noriko's picture of her father masterfully fades to his funeral portrait, Gunbuster shows that, in this war against the space monsters, death is never far away. Noriko, and by extension mankind in general, are forced to confront this inevitability. The space monsters are an unthinking horde, and their onslaught will only cease when one of 2 things happen. Either the human race is destroyed, or they are. Admiral Takaya, Smith, and the myriad unnamed soldiers who have fallen in the line of duty are all microcosmic examples of this zero-sum game in action. In that sense, Episode 1 is the outlier, not Episode 6. This atmosphere of solemnity is where the story has been headed from nearly the beginning. And about that atmosphere, it's masterfully handled. Episode 6 of Gunbuster is among the most emotionally effective episodes of any anime series I've ever seen. Every single character understands how insane what they're doing is, the microscopic odds of success, to say nothing of the ethics of unalterably disfiguring the known universe and committing what amounts to mass genocide of an alien race. In light of this, it's not surprising that Episode 6 of Gunbuster, much like the ending to the Wings of Honneamise before it, constantly invokes God. And much like that intrepid astronaut at the end of Gainax's debut work, their invocation of God does not, indeed cannot, provide any easy answers. What they're doing is without precedent in the entirety of human history. Like Shiro, the characters of Gunbuster can only hope that their path is a righteous one and pray for a miracle. That all being said, we now need to address the elephant in the room, perhaps the single most pervasive facet of Episode 6's atmosphere, its decision to animate the episode entirely in black and white. This is a major source of misinformation among fans, as many people are under the impression, based upon some of Gainax's subsequent work, that this was a decision made under budgetary pressures to save money. In fact, this couldn't be further from the truth. The Nontenki Memoirs states that, in actuality, the decision to animate in black and white actually made Episode 6 more expensive to animate. No, this was a conscious choice on the part of director Hideaki Anno to add a heightened sense of drama, and personally, I can't imagine this episode any other way. The harsh, monochromatic visuals serve to filter our attention solely on the essential drama, something I feel would have been diluted if the episode was in color. Anyway, Kazumi's arrival on the Eltrium begins the operation in earnest. She reunites with Noriko and Jung, both of whom have remained in space and, as such, are still as young as ever. Their meeting is bittersweet. Once more, Jung gives Kazumi shit for coming out on top in their rivalry, while Noriko comes to the realization that, by mission's end, Kimiko will probably be dead. Once again, she feels completely isolated, but she's come much too far, and has much too important of a mission to consider backing out now. The battle, as could be expected, is unbelievably savage, with both sides suffering incalculable losses. And unfortunately, the collective efforts of mankind appear to have been for nothing. Only 98% of the black hole bomb's slave generators have activated, meaning a detonation is impossible. In the words of the operations executive officers, the miracle didn't happen. To Noriko, this is an unacceptable surrender. If a miracle didn't happen, then she'll make one happen herself, because, as another anime heroine would so memorably phrase it, acts of men are greater than acts of God. She volunteers to travel to the center of the black hole bomb and detonate the Gunbuster's generator to kickstart the bomb's detonation. Kazumi volunteers to join Noriko as backup, and the two dive deep into the core of the bomb. Jung, unable to see her friends leave her alone, follows in her machine, but the two girls tell her to return. They have their roles, and she has hers. She needs to return to Earth and become their final connection to the present day. Jung tearfully agrees, promising, once they return to Earth, she'll greet them with a great big welcome back, the exact same message she greeted them with when they returned from their first mission in Episode 2. Noriko and Kazumi eventually reach the core, but the pressure of the bomb's atmosphere has rendered most of Gunbuster's systems inoperable. Once again, the question of whether their efforts have made any difference hangs over their head, but Noriko, once again, refuses to take this lying down. In a moment so pregnant with meaning that any sort of comment on it would be redundant, Noriko breaks open the machine's chest, takes out its heart, and thrusts it into the center of the bomb, beginning the detonation. All ships begin a long-range warp, but because the Gunbuster is so irreversibly damaged, it cannot join them. There is no chance that Noriko and Kazumi will ever see any of their friends again. The Gunbuster, against all odds, has made it back to Earth, but because of time dilation, 12,000 years have passed. Forget Jung and Kimiko. The real question is whether mankind as a whole still exists anymore. That question is answered when, in one of the most emotionally powerful moments in any work of art I've ever seen, a series of lights begins to flicker across the planet's surface, spelling out, "Welcome back." Jung may have been dead for 12 millennia, but she managed to keep her promise. Overcome with emotion, the two girls board their escape pods and rejoin the Earth, their long, difficult mission finally over. Thus ends Gunbuster, and holy shit, what an insanely emotional ride it's been. Trying to figure out some way, any way, to conclude a video like this feels like an impossibility, but I think I figured out a way to give it the ending it deserves. Those of you who are watching this after my video on the Wings of Honneamise must have picked up on a heavy sense of irony. In their proposal for that film, Hiroyuki Yamaga and Toshio Okada criticized the anime industry of the 1980s for catering to the superficial whims of anime fans to the exclusion of anything else, and at that time, that meant hyperfixating on giant robots and cute girls. And now, with Gunbuster, the same men who complained about giant robots and cute girls have created a show with the biggest giant robot and the cutest girls. What can be made of this? Obviously, we can point the finger somewhat at the Wings of Honneamise's financial disappointment and the need to make something that would sell. That was literally in the contract Bandai drafted for the project, after all. And that could be where the story ends. A studio tries something avant-garde, is met with failure, and thus falls back on the guaranteed commercial success. It's arguable that some of Gainax themselves see Gunbuster in this way. An oft-repeated statement about the show from Okada condemns it not as a creative work, but a commodity. An odd judgment coming from the guy who drafted the initial concept. But to condemn Gunbuster to such a legacy is a judgment I find profoundly unfair. Yes, the show is infinitely more conventional than a sui generis character study like the Wings of Honneamise, and if that's the metric Gainax's output should be judged on, then yes, the show's a failure. But obviously, this is not what I think. This is not just a stupid robot girl anime. Beyond just about any other show I've seen, Gunbuster demonstrates that just because you're drawing from more conventional sources doesn't mean that you're condemned to create a conventional product. Space Battleship Yamato, The Forever War, Aim for the Ace, Getter Robo, Gunbuster pilters from all of them to create a final product that, to my eyes at least, is more alike the Wings of Honneamise than different. Consider, both center on an unlikely protagonist faced with a challenge that the rest of the world views as insurmountable. Using the wisdom and strength of those around them, that protagonist refuses to give up, and against all odds, accomplishes their goal. Whether we're dealing with a world made from the ground up or a conventional sci-fi setting, man's first flight into space or an unwinnable interstellar war, a man trying to find the meaning in his life or a girl trying to overcome her trauma, the DNA of the stories are the same, and Gainax should be proud of what they've accomplished. Just because you're drawing from anime, or tokusatsu, or science fiction novels, doesn't mean you can't create something beautiful, something that can change the life of whoever watches it. The mere fact that Gunbuster is still, 35 years after its debut, considered one of the greatest anime series ever made, is a testament to that fact.